She boarded the plane like any other passenger, dressed in a navy blue blazer and matching slacks, holding nothing but a leather-bound folder in one hand and her phone in the other. To most, she looked like a regular business traveler, calm, composed, maybe even a little tired. Her name was Ava Monroe, and no one knew that the quiet woman stepping onto that flight had the power to shake a billion-dollar empire. The gate agent barely glanced up as Ava scanned her boarding pass. "First class, seat 2A, the woman said with a forced smile. Ava nodded, made her way down the jet bridge and took her seat. She was early. The cabin was still mostly empty. The seats smelled faintly of leather and citrus-scented cleaner. Flight attendants bustled up and down the aisles, prepping drinks and fluffing pillows. Ava simply sat and waited, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. 10 minutes later, things changed. A soft-spoken flight attendant leaned over her. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I'm going to have to ask you to step out for a moment." Ava blinked. "Excuse me?" The attendant didn't raise her voice, but the tension in her eyes was obvious. "There's been a seat assignment issue. The gate crew needs to speak with you." Ava didn't argue. She stood, gathered her folder, and stepped back into the jet bridge. At the gate, the same agent who barely looked at her before now avoided her eyes. "We're going to need to move you to a different seat," the agent said. "There's been a change in policy regarding upgrades." Ava frowned. "But this isn't an upgrade. I purchased this ticket weeks ago." The agent shifted uncomfortably. "We understand. It's just company policy. There's nothing we can do." Ava stared at her. The surrounding passengers moved in waves, heads ducked, into phones, backpacks slung over shoulders. No one noticed the quiet humiliation happening just a few feet away. She could have pushed harder, could have demanded a supervisor, but instead she gave the agent a long, unreadable look and nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice level. "Let's go find my new seat." They placed her in 23B, middle seat, economy, sandwiched between two strangers. No apology, no explanation, no eye contact. For the rest of the flight, Ava didn't say a word. But she didn't forget. And hours later, neither would the airline. While that scene unfolded mid-morning in another part of the city, something entirely different was happening. A moment of quiet grace that would ripple far beyond its modest beginning. It was a crowded subway platform during rush hour. People pushed and shuffled, coats brushing, bags bumping, eyes darting. Among them stood a teenage boy named Elijah, tall, thin, his hoodie a little too big, his shoes well worn. He had his earbuds in, backpack slung over one shoulder, staring down at the cracked screen of his phone as he waited for the train. Beside him stood a woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. Her face was pale, eyes tired, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly, clearly pregnant though trying not to make a show of it. She looked around for a place to sit as the train pulled in. But when the doors opened, the seats were already gone. Elijah saw her hesitate. He didn't think long. He tapped her shoulder, pulled out one earbud and said, "You can have my seat." She blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," he nodded. "My legs work fine." She smiled faintly. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." She took the seat slowly with effort, settling in as the train jolted forward. Elijah stood nearby, holding the rail. They didn't speak after that. The moment passed quickly, unnoticed by almost everyone around them. But a few stops later, just before she got off, the woman reached into her purse and handed Elijah a folded piece of paper. He opened it as she disappeared into the crowd. What was written inside would change his life forever. Back in the city, Ava stepped into a glass-walled office high above the skyline, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was calm but firm. "Yes, they moved me. No explanation. Something about policy." She paused, listened. "It's done," she said finally. "Pull it. All of it." The line went silent for a beat. Then came the reply. "Understood." Hours later, the airline's corporate boardroom was in chaos. An entire contract, worth $1.3 billion, was gone. Just like that. A deal that had taken months of negotiations vanished in a single phone call, and none of the suits around the table could understand how it had happened. They didn't know who Ava Monroe really was. They didn't know what kind of power she held. But they were about to find out. And the teenager on the train? He had no idea that the woman he gave his seat to wasn't just grateful. She was someone deeply connected to Ava's world, someone who would soon reach out to him in a way that would turn his ordinary life into something extraordinary. These two stories, unfolding miles apart, tied together by quiet choices, unseen connections, and the kind of dignity that doesn't make headlines, were about to collide. Because sometimes, the people we overlook are the very ones who hold everything in their hands. And sometimes, all it takes is a folded note, a moved seat, or a quiet act of disrespect to trigger a reckoning no one saw coming. The plane landed, the train doors closed, and everything was about to change. Do you want me to continue from here into the next part of the story? The sun was dipping low by the time Ava Monroe stepped out of the airport and into the waiting black SUV. The city buzzed around her, lights flickering, and horns echoing through the streets. She sat in the back seat in silence, her eyes tracing the skyline but seeing none of it. Her mind was somewhere else, still in that moment on the plane, that quiet sting of being dismissed. Not because there was a real problem, not because she'd done something wrong, but because someone looked at her, made an assumption, and decided she didn't belong in that seat. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, unsure if he should speak. He didn't. She was known for keeping things quiet. Even those who worked closely with her rarely got more than a nod or a few calm words. It wasn't that Ava was cold. She just didn't waste energy on noise. When she acted, it was deliberate. Controlled. Powerful. And tonight her next move was already in motion. Inside her mind, she replayed the moment at the gate, the way the agent's tone had changed when she saw her name, her face. How quickly the smile vanished, replaced with vague discomfort. Company policy. It was always some kind of policy, something flexible for some passengers, but suddenly written in stone when it came to her. What they didn't know was that Ava Monroe wasn't just a frequent flyer or a well-dressed professional. She was a key partner in a tech firm that handled logistical infrastructure for some of the largest airlines in the world. The airline that bumped her off her seat. They were under contract with her company, and their future relied on technology that Ava had helped fund and develop. But they hadn't recognized her. Or worse, maybe they had and didn't care. Either way, they were about to feel the consequences. Elsewhere, Elijah sat on a worn-out couch in his grandmother's apartment, the note still in his hands. He read it again, even though he'd already memorized every word. You reminded me. That kindness still exists. Please don't stop being you. This world needs people like you. Just that, no phone number, no full name, just M. And yet it didn't feel small. It felt personal, thoughtful. Like someone had seen him, really seen him, for the first time in a long time. His grandmother, Miss Laverne, looked over from the kitchen. You okay, baby? He nodded, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Yeah, just thinking. About that lady on the train? He raised an eyebrow. How'd you know? Know my grandson. You come home looking like that, head full of something, I know it's not homework. She chuckled softly, drying her hands with a towel. What did she say? Just, thank you. She wrote it down. Some folks don't say thank you at all. That's already something. He didn't respond, but he kept thinking about it. Why had she written a note? Why not just say it and move on? There was something about the way she'd looked at him before stepping off the train, like she wanted to say more, but couldn't. Or maybe wasn't allowed to. The next morning, Elijah walked to school the same way he always did, dodging trash, cans and weaving around parked cars, earbuds in, hoodie up. He moved like someone trying not to be noticed, not because he was hiding, but because that's what life had taught him. Don't draw attention. Don't ask for trouble. Stay out of the way. But lately he'd been wondering if maybe the world was changing. That note, it wasn't a big thing, but it had stirred something inside him. A question he hadn't asked in a while. What if things could be different? At the same time, Ava sat in a high-rise office overlooking the river, her team scattered, across the long table before her. No one spoke at first. They were waiting. "We're suspending the rollout with Skylinks," she said flatly. A few gasps, a couple of stunned glances. "But Ava," one of the execs said carefully, "that's one of our biggest contracts. It'll send a message." "I know," she replied. "That's the point." There was a long pause. "You want them to come to us?" "I want them to learn," she said. "They think people like me are just passengers, replaceable, invisible. They'll learn that disrespect costs." She turned away from the table and stared out the window. It always costs something. That's when the whispers started. Social media picked up on the disruption. Rumors of a massive tech pullout, an airline facing unexpected delays. No one could pin down exactly what had happened. But something was shaking behind the scenes. Something big. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Elijah's name was quietly passed along from inbox to inbox, thanks to the woman he'd helped, who, it turned out, wasn't just some random passenger. Her name was Morgan Kane, a journalist. One with deep connections and an instinct for stories that mattered. She hadn't planned to be on that train. She'd been on her way to interview a source when she nearly fainted from the weight of the day, and the weight of the baby she hadn't told anyone about yet. Elijah's kindness had caught her off guard, and she'd written that note in a rush, thinking maybe she'd never see him again. But she couldn't let it end there. Now she was digging. Who was this kid? Where did he come from? What else hadn't the world seen in him? Because sometimes the people who shine brightest are the ones who don't even know it. Ava, too, had received Morgan's message. A quiet nod that the two women's paths had just crossed unknowingly through this young man, and though she didn't usually involve herself in personal stories, something about this one lingered. A boy with no reason to help, no reason to be gentle, had done so anyway. She saw a younger version of herself in him. She had a feeling his story wasn't over yet, but neither was hers. The airline executives still hadn't responded to the suspension. Maybe they thought it was a bluff. Maybe they were scrambling behind the scenes. Either way, Ava wasn't backing down. She'd seen too much, been through too much, to stay quiet. And as all these threads moved quietly toward each other, the tension was building. No one outside that boardroom knew why the airline's numbers were suddenly slipping. No one on Elijah's block knew why a reporter had started asking questions about the quiet kid with the too big hoodie. And no one knew that. Two powerful women, one who built empires and one who told truths, had just decided that the world needed to hear his name. But the moment was coming, because in a world that too often looks the other way, someone had finally looked straight at him and decided he mattered, and soon the whole world would too. Would you like me to continue building the next part of the story? 3 days after Ava pulled the $1.3 billion contract, the airline still hadn't made a public statement. Internally, chaos ruled. Executives whispered in hallways, teams were called into emergency meetings, and consultants were being flown in from every direction. The loss had shaken the company, but the deeper concern wasn't just the money, it was the silence. Ava Monroe wasn't someone who left things half done. If she'd started something, there was more coming, and no one at the top could guess what it was. Meanwhile, in a small neighborhood in Southside Brooklyn, Elijah walked home from school with a strange feeling sitting heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure what had shifted, but something had. Ever since that day on the train, he'd been noticing things, like how people looked at him differently. It started with Ms. Delaney, the English teacher who usually barely called on him. Now she lingered when she spoke to him, gave him extra time to answer, asked about his writing. Then the principal suddenly knew his name and asked about college plans. And yesterday, a woman had stopped him outside the school, saying she was just a friend of someone he'd helped, and handed him a business card. "Keep doing what you're doing," she said before walking away. Elijah didn't tell anyone. Not his grandmother, not his friends. He couldn't explain it yet, and part of him didn't want to jinx it. But word was spreading, quietly. At the same time, Morgan Kane sat in her newsroom, scrolling through social media, emails, texts. She'd been trying to find an angle, something that tied all of this together. The contract pull, the mysterious tech firm, the teenage boy who gave up a seat. It all felt connected, like a puzzle with missing pieces. She knew Ava Monroe had power, serious power, but no one really knew much about her personal life. She kept her name out of headlines, refused interviews, and rarely appeared in photos. Still, Morgan had a hunch. The way Ava moved, deliberate, strategic, meant this story wasn't over. Morgan's editor was skeptical. "Let me get this straight," he said, arms folded. "You want to write a feature about a teenager on the train and a corporate tech takedown in the same breath?" "Yes," Morgan replied. "Because they're not separate stories, they're part of the same one. The world ignores the quiet people until one of them shakes everything." Her editor shook his head, unsure. "Find me something concrete." So, she kept digging. In a different part of the city, a meeting was taking place behind closed doors. High-rise office, large windows, expensive suits. The airline's crisis response team had been brought in to handle the Ava situation. They were running simulations, legal options, and public relations damage control strategies. But the data wasn't helping. The numbers were falling. Shareholders were asking questions. Customers were noticing delayed flights. And someone inside had finally asked the right question. Why did she walk away so suddenly? That was when a younger analyst, barely 2 years on the job, brought up Ava's travel history. "She's flown with us 19 times in the last year. All first class, all full price, never late, never a complaint." The room went quiet. "Then why move her to coach?" someone asked. No one had an answer. Ava, in the meantime, was in a private workspace outside the city. No windows, no noise, just silence and strategy. Her assistant Naomi stood nearby, holding a folder. "They're asking around," Naomi said. Quietly, "No public move yet." Ava nodded once. "Let them wonder." She turned to her desk, where Elijah's face was on the screen, an image from a nearby school event someone had shared online. "Find out what he wants," she said softly. "What he needs. School, stability, future. Let's start there." Naomi hesitated. "Should we reach out directly?" "Not yet. Let him live a little longer without knowing. The world already takes too much from people like him before they're ready." That was Ava. Cold to some, calculated to others, but always thinking 10 moves ahead. She didn't just react. She reshaped the field. Back at Elijah's school, things were getting strange. A local nonprofit reached out to sponsor a scholarship in his name, except no one had ever heard of them before. A reporter asked to sit in on his next class. One of his friends joked, "Yo, you famous now or something." Elijah just shrugged. "I don't know. I gave a seat to somebody." But it wasn't just the seat. It was what it represented. In a world where people were always rushing, pushing, and ignoring one another, he had chosen to do something quiet and good, and someone noticed, and that someone had influence. Morgan finally made the connection. She found Ava Monroe's corporate schedule. She traced her flight. She matched it to the airline's records. Then she found Ava had been bumped on the same day Elijah gave up his seat. 2 acts of transportation, 2 moments of grace or disrespect. One woman who had the power to shake the system. One boy who offered kindness without expecting anything. The pieces fit. Now Morgan just needed to get close enough to Ava or Elijah to confirm it. But getting to either wasn't going to be easy. Meanwhile, Ava received another message. Anonymous. Short. Just 1 line. "You're making noise. Be careful how loud." She read it twice, then deleted it. It didn't scare her. But it told her something important. Someone inside the airline, or connected to it, was watching her. And not just watching. Worried. Elijah's world was also shifting, in ways he didn't fully understand yet. Teachers started pulling him aside. A college prep counselor who had never bothered with him suddenly showed up with a folder full of scholarship options. At first, he liked the attention, but then came the other side, people who thought he was acting different. A few classmates started mocking him. One even said, "Guess you think you're better than us now, huh?" He didn't. But he couldn't explain what was happening either. One night, he finally asked his grandmother, "Granny, if something good happens to you out of nowhere, like out of the blue, you think it means something bad's coming too?" She gave him a look. "Why you say that, baby?" "I don't know, just feels like something's waiting. Like I'm in the middle of something, but I can't see what." Miss Laverne sighed, wiped her hands, and sat beside him. "Sometimes when good shows up, the world don't know what to do with it. Don't mean it's bad. Just means you gotta stand firm and wait to see what it becomes." Elijah nodded slowly, and somewhere in the shadows of this fast-moving story, someone else was watching. Not Ava, not Morgan, but someone in the airline's private network. Someone who knew exactly why Ava had been moved from her seat. It wasn't a mistake. It was a test. One that had gone wrong. And now, the stakes were higher than anyone knew. Would you like the next part to go deeper into Ava's backstory, or focus more on Elijah's discovery of the truth? Late one night, under a cold sweep of rain, Elijah stood in front of the mirror in his room, staring at his reflection like he was trying to figure out who he was becoming. Things had shifted too fast. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to being asked what he wanted out of life. For so long, he'd been focused on surviving, staying low, keeping out of trouble. Now, doors were opening, and he didn't know what was waiting on the other side. He pulled the folded note out of his jacket pocket. It was worn now, the edges curled from how many times he'd read it. Still, every time he unfolded it, those words made him pause. "This world needs people like you." He didn't know why, but he felt like something bigger was coming. Like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite see yet. Across the city, in a sleek, dimly lit office, Ava Monroe sat alone. Her team had gone home, but she stayed late, staring at the city lights, tapping a pen against her glass desk. Naomi had delivered the report on Elijah. His grades, his family, his background. The boy had been through things that would have broken some people, but instead of bitterness, he'd offered kindness. Quiet, unexpected kindness. Ava had been like that once, before the world taught her that sometimes kindness made you a target. But seeing him, hearing what he did, it stirred something in her. A reminder of who she used to be before boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts. She picked up her phone, opened a secure messaging app, and sent a short message to her legal advisor. Time to move forward, quietly, but make sure they feel it. She was done waiting. The airline, still scrambling behind the scenes, had finally realized who they'd messed with. But what they didn't know was that Ava had more than just legal weapons at her disposal. She had influence. And now she had motivation. While they held emergency meetings, trying to craft an apology that didn't sound like a confession, something else was happening. A whistleblower, someone on the inside, had reached out to Morgan Kane. The tip was short but enough to make her heart race. The seat reassignment wasn't random. Morgan stared at the message, then read it again. She called back the number attached to it, but it was disconnected. Still, it was enough. Enough to start digging into employee protocols. Enough to cross-reference names, access logs, and internal memos. And what she found made her stomach drop. Ava Monroe had been flagged before she even arrived at the gate. Someone had run a background on her the moment her name popped up in the booking system. They'd marked her file with a tag, a code that essentially allowed the gate agent to move her without much explanation. Policy enforcement. But what policy? It didn't exist in writing. Morgan had seen these tactics before. Quiet biases, baked into systems. Invisible walls meant to look like rules. She printed the evidence, laid it out on her desk, and stared at it in silence. The pieces were all there now, and she wasn't the only one who knew it. Back in Southside Brooklyn, Elijah had just finished dinner when someone knocked at the door. Miss Laverne wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened it slowly. A woman stood there, well-dressed, calm, but with an energy that felt too sharp to be casual. "I'm Morgan Kane," she said gently. "I believe your grandson helped me on the train last week. I've been trying to reach him." Laverne looked her up and down, then called back into the apartment. "Eli, you got company." Elijah came around the corner, eyes wary. Morgan offered a small smile. "Hi. You probably don't remember me. I just wanted to say thank you, in person. And also, there's something I think you should know." They sat down in the small living room. Morgan pulled a folder from her bag and handed it to him. "This is about you and the airline, and something much bigger." Elijah flipped through the papers, reading slowly, carefully. His hands started to shake a little. "They did this to her?" he asked, voice low. Morgan nodded. "And your kindness may have been the thing that brought it to light. Ava Monroe saw what you did, and now everything is in motion." He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being part of something this big. He wasn't even sure he wanted to be. But now that he knew, the truth it felt impossible to ignore. At the same time, inside the airline's executive offices, the final report landed on the CEO's desk. It was bad, worse than expected. Ava Monroe had pulled funding, but she'd also sent signals to several other tech partners. Subtle moves, but ones that created doubt. The company's value was slipping, and the board was getting nervous. And then came the leak. Morgan's article hit the internet like lightning. No names were confirmed, but the story was there. How a woman of color had been quietly bumped from her seat using a system of unwritten policies. How a teenage boy's small act of kindness had caught her attention. And how one silent action triggered a chain of consequences the company never saw coming. The article didn't just trend, it exploded. People were furious. Not just at the airline, but at the idea that this kind of thing could happen at all. Stories poured in. Others who'd been reassigned for vague reasons. Passengers who were never quite sure why their upgrades disappeared. The airline's PR team scrambled to respond, but the damage was done. The name Ava Monroe was everywhere now, and so was Elijah's, though Morgan kept his identity protected. Still, whispers grew. Someone even posted a blurry photo of him walking into school. He tried to keep his head down, but the looks were different now. Some admiring, some envious. Some filled with questions he couldn't answer. Back in her private space, Ava watched it unfold with silent satisfaction. But she knew it wasn't over. This was only the spark. The real storm hadn't hit yet, and in the middle of it all, a sealed envelope arrived at Elijah's door. No name. Just his. Inside was a single note and a plane ticket. The note read, "Sometimes the seat they take from you was never meant to hold you. Bigger things are waiting. Come see." There was no signature, but Elijah knew exactly who it was from. He stared at the ticket in his hand, heart pounding. And just like that, everything he thought he knew about his life, his path, his future, began to shift. But what waited for him on the other end? That no one could answer. Would you like me to continue with the story's resolution next? Elijah didn't sleep much that night. The plane ticket sat on his desk like it was glowing in the dark, demanding his attention. He kept reading the note over and over again, wondering what it meant. Bigger things are waiting. But where? Why now? And what would he even say if he met Ava Monroe? He didn't even know what to wear on a plane, let alone how to act around billionaires and power players. All he'd done was give up a seat. Now, it felt like he was being asked to take one at a table he never even imagined existed. Miss Laverne came into his room before sunrise. She didn't ask questions at first, just looked at the ticket, then at Elijah. "You gonna go?" she asked. "I don't know." She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand finding his. Sometimes God puts you in places you didn't ask for, but maybe it's because the world needs you there more than you need to understand it. He nodded slowly. But deep down, something still didn't sit right. Not fear, something else. Like the story wasn't done yet. like there was more behind. That bump on the plane than anyone had figured out. And he was right. Across the city, Morgan Kane woke up to a burner phone buzzing on her kitchen table. She'd gotten used to strange tips coming in, but this one stopped her cold. A single photo, grainy, low light, but clearly showing an airline executive, someone she'd already flagged, meeting with a man in an alley behind a private club. The second man's face was partially turned, but something about the stance, the build, the surroundings, it screamed quiet power. Then the second message came. Follow the money. It wasn't just about Ava. Morgan dropped her coffee, barely, noticing the crash as the cup shattered on the floor. She opened her laptop, heart pounding, and started digging. The deeper she looked, the worse it got. Financial records, donations, private investments linked to shell companies that all led back to a single defense contractor. One that Ava's tech firm had refused to work with a year ago. And now, suddenly, that same contractor had begun a quiet partnership with the airline under a different name. It wasn't just about a seat. It was a message. Ava had been targeted. On purpose. Not because of her name. Not just because of her race or power. But because she'd said no to a project she believed crossed a moral line. And now, someone had tried to humiliate her quietly, in public, to let others know what happened to people who didn't cooperate. And Elijah? He wasn't just a bystander. He had unintentionally exposed the whole thing. Morgan sat back stunned. This wasn't just a corporate embarrassment. It was a coordinated move. And someone high up had tried to bury it, until a teenage boy's kindness brought it all to the surface. Meanwhile, Ava stood in a private meeting room with Naomi and two men in suits. One of them, her legal strategist. The other, someone from a federal agency. She placed the newly leaked data on the table. "This is bigger than us now," she said calmly. "And I'm not going to be quiet," the federal agent nodded slowly. "But it means you're a target now, more than before." "I have always been a target," Ava replied. "I just stopped flinching." Naomi cleared her throat, then hesitated. "There's something else. We just confirmed it. Elijah's father. He's not who we thought he was." Ava turned, her face changing ever so slightly. "What do you mean?" "He's not absent. He disappeared. Government records show he worked for the same contractor trying to take you down. Then he went off the grid 8 years ago." Ava stood silent for a moment. "Does Elijah know?" "No," Naomi said quietly. "And there's no sign that his grandmother ever told him." That changed everything. Now Ava wasn't just helping a kind young man. She might be protecting someone whose family was already tangled in the shadows of this power struggle. Someone who might be more involved than he realized. And that meant the people behind the scenes wouldn't just sit back and let him fly out to meet her. On the other side of the city, Elijah left for school like it was any normal morning. But the moment he stepped outside, he noticed the black SUV parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine still running. He paused, pretending to check his phone, then kept walking. The SUV didn't move. But he saw someone shift in the front seat, just enough to know they were watching him. That night after school, the same SUV was parked outside the corner store 2 blocks from his house. The feeling in his chest changed. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was warning. He didn't tell Miss Laverne, didn't want to worry her, but he called Morgan. "I think someone's watching me," he said quietly. Morgan's voice was sharp on the other end. "Don't go anywhere alone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived, she took one look at the SUV and pulled Elijah into the back seat of her car. "We need to move," she said. "There's more going on than we thought, and I think you're in the middle of it." Elijah didn't ask questions. He just nodded. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew. A few hours later, Morgan pulled up to a discreet airfield on the outskirts of the city. A private jet sat waiting. A familiar silhouette stood near the stairs, arms crossed, Ava Monroe. She watched Elijah step out of the car, eyes wary, shoulders tense. But she didn't speak right away. She let him walk closer, let him feel the weight of this moment. Then she said, "You ready?" Elijah nodded once. "Not really." but I came anyway. She smiled faintly. That's how most important stories begin. As the jet door closed behind them and the engines roared to life, another call was being placed. A man in a quiet office watching the plane lift into the sky. He turned to someone. Behind him, face hidden in shadow. They're moving too fast. We need to act now. The reply came cold and certain. Then we bring the boy's past to light. He thinks he's the hero. Let's show the world he's the liability. The plane kept climbing, unaware, but the storm it was flying into was just beginning to break. Would you like the next part to reveal the true nature of Elijah's past and how it ties to Ava's mission?